Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about the pressing news that we're hearing over here in the United States about the protest um, going on in Israel regarding the judicial reform. As I mentioned a little bit in the Candace Owens video, somewhat, right now in Israel there is an unprecedented civil conflict occurring between multiple sides over what is the future of the world's only Jewish democracy and the only democracy, really the only functioning democracy in the Middle East and the United States' greatest ally in the Middle East and probably throughout the entire world. What is the future of Israeli politics going to be? Is Israel going to be a state that is largely ruled by both the legislative branch and the executive branch, meaning the Knesset and the Prime Minister? And keep in mind, it's a parliamentary system. It's not like a congressional system like we have. The Knesset members are appointed by the Prime Minister. So that this would inevitably give the Prime Minister more power, Prime Minister Netanyahu more power to appoint and to change the laws on the books. And keep in mind as well, Israel's constitution is not a written constitution. We have a written constitution. We have a constitution written into law that was written at the time of our independence, and it's been modified through amendments. But much like Great Britain, Israel does not have a written constitution, and their constitution is understood. It's an unwritten document, so it can be changed. But what it does have is basic a group of what they call basic laws, basic understandings, and this is exactly what Netanyahu and his party coalition, his right wing party coalition, wants to amend, to change. And of course, they want to amend and change this because it be to his benefit. Netanyahu, of course, is under charges for corruption, money embezzlement, and a whole bunch of other host of civil crimes. And he he doesn't want to do jail time. So, given that they don't have a written constitution and the laws are much more arbitrary than our laws, you can't there's nothing in chapter and verse that you can point to and say, well, the chief executive officer, in this case the prime minister, or in our case the president, is violating certain such and such laws. So it's not like a situation that it would be, say, if Donald Trump were doing this kind of stuff, because there's nothing written down. It's all understood, and it's all by tradition and by custom. And it's much more arbitrary. But say, for example, the courts, the judicial branch of the Israeli government becomes much more politicized, and a person like Netanyahu is able to appoint who he wants based on party affiliation. Now, he's a Likud party member, and that is, of course, a right wing party. If he's able to do that, then they will start to what they call legislate from the bench, and they will start to change the laws and change it according to their will, because there's no set rubric, there's no set parameters that they have to use. There's not starting out with an A, so they can make up the A to get to Z. You understand? And this is very dangerous. This is how dictatorships are made, because there's no restraint on them. This is the problem that England has always had. You know what I mean? Yes, England had a basic framework in 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta and then Treaty of Runnymede. and then it was expanded upon, and eventually the powers of the monarch were severely constricted, but again, by custom. Nothing set in stone. It has to be set in stone, and the people of Israel, the ethnic group of Israel, should understand this more than any other ethnic group, because in the course of human events, they, the Jewish people, were the people that originally initiated the set in stone laws that were not based upon the whims, the arbitrary whims of a ruler or rulers, or a monarch or an oligarch. They had a set of laws that everyone, including the ruler, had to abide by, and these are the laws of the mitzvot, the laws of the Torah. Not saying that they should apply the halakha or the Jewish laws to today's modern society. Of course, it's not applicable because Israel is a secular country, a Jewish democracy, and that phrase also is coming into question. Initially, we know that the modern state of Israel was founded upon the principle of Zionism, the principle of Jewish nationalism. But what does it mean to be both a Jewish and a democratic state? Given that the Jewish religion is a legalistic religion, the concept of rule of law was originated by the Jewish people and passed on to Western culture uh, by um, via Christianity to other cultures, and eventually ended up in the Anglo-Saxon society. Not to say that the Law of Moses or the Old Testament laws, the Ten Commandments, were the first laws ever written, but they were the first laws to ever constrain the arbitrary rule of a ruler or a group of rulers. Because everyone, even the Kohanim, even the king later when they had a king, even the judges of Israel were subject to this law of God. That wasn't the case in prior legal systems, such as the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi could be amended according to whatever Mesopotamian ruler wanted, whatever Mesopotamian ruler that was around at the time wanted to do. Um, that executive office, whatever the executive office, didn't have that much power. The judicial branch, I mean, the judicial branch was the supreme branch in in Israel's construction originally and during biblical times. The book of Judges establishes this. And that was the framework that the founders of the modern state of Israel used, as where the judicial branch had the most power over the executive branch and over the legislative branch. What Netanyahu wants is to establish the legislative branch, which is in concert with the branch, as more powerful than the judicial branch. And this would throw out of whack the system of checks and balances, which Israel has. But unlike us, our system of checks and balances is written in stone. It's written there. There's no written constitution. So being there's no written constitution, everything can be flexible. And this is crazy. And you don't hear anything from Joe Biden, from other lawmakers in the United States that are big pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. They stand with Israel. They're with Israel in every single conflict. They're with them against Iran. They're with them against the Palestinians. They're quick to speak on the external conflicts that Israel is facing, but they're not quick to criticize the political Machiavellian-esque tactics of a person like Benjamin Netanyahu. Ask yourself, how does Benjamin Netanyahu stay in power for as long as he stayed in power? The man has been in power and has been in office since 2009. And he recently got out of office and then he returned to office despite all his corruption charges. Is he that great of a leader? We often hear that he is the reason that Israel has become the starter-up nation that it's become, that he produced the economic miracle that made Israel the industrious nation that it's become in the latter half of the 2010s, that he took off a lot of the socialist restraints that were placed upon Israel during its founding. Because it's no secret to anyone who is a student of history that Israel was founded indeed with a socialist nationalist platform. Some would say a racist platform. The irony is that most of the founders of the state of Israel were indeed leftists, so economic prosperity was not at the top of their priority list when they were establishing a nation. Hell, some of the first settlements on the land were kibbutzim. They were farmers collectives. So they say that it was him who took some of these restraints off. He went to high school in Massachusetts. He studied for years in the United States. He was influenced by Ronald Reagan and the neoconservative movement of the 1980s, economic deregulation movement of the likes of Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, and their neoliberal economic policy. So he took a lot of those restraints off when he got in charge as the first as the finance minister and later as the prime minister in his second term, 2009. Post 2009, he didn't really do that in the 90s. When he was in power, but towards 2009 he did, and plus he in his foreign policy he basically eliminated all talks with the Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, basically declaring outright to the Palestinians that their desire for a state of their own, independent from Israel, and the removal of the military occupation in places like the West Bank was not going to happen. Even under a right-wing regime like Ariel Sharon's, we thought with the 2006 evacuation, at least nominally, the 2006 evacuation of Gaza, that it was going to happen, that eventually Israel was going to reverse course from the 1967 war and pull out of the territories. But that didn't happen. That inevitably, because of Netanyahu and his policy telling the Palestinians basically that their desire for a state was a fantasy, make believe, and not only doing that, but by blatantly establishing, even to the chagrin of the United Nations and the United States. This was one of the biggest contentions between Netanyahu and Barack Obama, as we talked about in other videos, was that Netanyahu disregarded Obama's warning for Israelis to not establish any more settlements in the West Bank. Obama was trying to get Netanyahu to respect the 1967, the pre-1967 borders and not establish any more Israeli settlements in that area. But Netanyahu didn't care. He continued to bolster the settler movement, continued to bolster their political ideologies, their revisionist Zionist political ideologies, far right-wing ideologies. Not like the Koch party, Nir Kahana's party, not that extreme, but to that extreme, to bolster the settler movement and to basically annex in everything, in all intents and purposes and all practicalities, all of the land that was supposed to be established according to Oslo as the state of Palestine. You know what I mean? Completely disregarding international law, completely disregarding what the United States was said to do. And that's when the tension arose between Obama and Netanyahu, but over the over the settler movement. Obama, uh, he tried and he tried to bring both sides to the table, but you had a guy like Netanyahu that he was so belligerent, he was so anti-Palestinian, he was so anti pro settler movement that he wasn't even willing to look at a person like Mahmoud Abbas or anybody in the Palestinian Authority for that matter and sit down at the table with them. They became Israelis for years in the 80s and the 90s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s would always complain that they don't have a partner for peace, that there's nobody willing to sit down to the table with them for peace, especially when in the 60s and 70s when Arafat was the leader of the PLO at that time. Before Oslo, before 1993, he was the leader of the PLO at that time, and he was really belligerent. He he would orchestrate terrorist attacks, everything. You know what I mean? Like the PLO was basically not recognized by Israel, and they didn't recognize Israel. They were basically in the 60s and 70s what Hamas is today. And during that time, uh, Israel never sat down for peace with anybody in the Palestinian Authority, then the PLO. They didn't recognize the legitimacy of the PLO. But with Oslo, it turned a corner. With Oslo, finally, and Israel would always complain, we don't have a partner for peace because nobody in the Palestinian Authority will sit down with us. But they didn't want to recognize anybody in the Palestinian Authority anyway. They wanted to have other Arab nations like Jordan and like Egypt speak on behalf of the Palestinians, speak on their behalf, because that's the way that it always been. That's the way it was during the treaties of the 48 war and the 67 war and the 73 war, especially the historic treaty between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin in 79. Other Arab nations spoke on behalf of the Palestinians. They didn't have their own sovereignty, they didn't have their own rights. It wasn't until officially 1988 when they declared their own statehood, and then in 1993, Israel semi recognized it, at least when it came to the Palestinian Authority. And then it pretty much became an accepted fact that Israel and whoever was in charge in Israel and whoever was in charge in the Palestinian Authority would negotiate land for peace deals. Like, okay, you give up this piece of land and we give up this piece of land. That's how it was with Ehud Barak. That's how it was with Omar in 2008 and Abbas. But then in 2009, when Netanyahu came in, Netanyahu was like, we're not doing that no more. We're not keeping up that pretense. We're not even meeting with anybody from the Palestinian Authority. And that in turn caused an internal warfare between the Palestinian factions. Hamas then declared that Fatah, which was the old PLO party of Arafat, was then ineffective and wasn't addressing sufficiently the needs of the Palestinian people, especially those in Gaza and in the West Bank territories. And Fatah kept getting elected in the West Bank, but in 2006, especially gave them semi-autonomy. Hamas got elected in Gaza and in the Golan Heights. Other Islamic parties like Hezbollah then took over from Lebanon. So it caused the failure of Oslo caused the Palestinians to move further to the right, and it also caused Israelis to move further to the right. So now, as we stand in 2023, 20 years after I mean, excuse me, 30 years after Oslo, Oslo was signed in 1993. We're in 2023, 30 years after Oslo. We are further, the sides are further apart than they've ever been. And not only are they further apart than they've ever been externally with one another, I mean, they are further apart from within each other's sides, within the Hamas side and the Fatah side on the Palestinian end, and with Likud and Labor, even within Likud. I mean, hell, the finance minister, Yoav Gallant, who was fired last night by Netanyahu, was a member of the Likud party, was a right winger in the Likud party, but he didn't pledge his undying loyalty to uh, to Netanyahu, so he got fired. So what is this? A mafia thing where Netanyahu is the boss of all bosses, where he demands undying loyalty to his initiatives and his goals within the Israeli government, and if they don't give that, they're fired. Is this a Thomas Becket issue? Will somebody rid me of this wretched priest, as King Henry II said to Thomas Becket? This is tyranny. This is complete tyranny and a complete overhaul of the democratic process. So 30 years removed from Oslo, and we're further apart than we've ever been. And not only are the sides further apart from each other, but they are further apart within each other. And there's a move towards extremists and a move towards insanity on both ends, on the Israeli end as well as the Palestinian end. We saw it on the Palestinian end in the latter half of the 2000s, after the Israelis pulled out of Gaza and they refused to meet head to head with anybody from the Palestinian side. That caused a shift from the secular attitudes of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority to the more Islamist side of Hamas. And now the failures of the peace process have caused a shift in ideology from the secular leftist side of Israel that had dominated Israeli politics forever since the beginning. Ben Gurion was a leftist. Moshe Sharett was a leftist. Golda Meir was a leftist up until the 70s with Begin. And even after that, you still had Rabin, you still had other leftists that were more popular among the Israelis, but increasingly is a move towards right wing. Right wing is a right wing ideology, and not only right wing ideology, but complete Middle Eastern style despotism, Oriental despotism, if for lack of a better term. So this is crazy. The people that initiated the rule of law, the people that initiated the constraints on executive power, the constraints on monarchism, and the constraints on dictatorship have now overridden the rule of law by undermining the judicial branch of the government and installing what is basically a puppet dictator. In the United States, that has been the supporter of Israel since 1948, the first nation on earth to recognize the modern state of Israel with President Truman at that time, has now, 30 years from Oslo, 30 years removed from Oslo, has now turned a blind eye as the champion of democracy and the champion of the free world has now let their greatest ally and friend undermine judicial freedom. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Love you.